The morning sun had just begun to stretch across the horizon, casting warm streaks of gold over the sleepy town of Dry Creek. It was the kind of town you could pass through without noticing. A single gas station, a diner with a cracked neon sign, and an old oak tree in the center of Main Street that everyone swore had been there longer than the buildings. People liked it that way. Nothing much happened in Dry Creek. And if it did, word traveled faster than the sheriff's pickup. That morning, a man sat outside the local café, the Roost, nursing a cup of tea like he had all the time in the world. He wasn't the kind of man you'd immediately notice. No loud voice, no flashy clothes. Just a dark denim shirt, rolled up to the elbows, and a watch that looked military grade but had clearly seen more dust than polish. His name was Cal Rourke. To the town, he was just the guy who rolled in a few months ago with a truck, 2 dogs, and no real reason to stay. But he was polite, always tipped well, and never said much more than necessary. Some folks said he was ex-military. Others thought maybe he used to be somebody famous. No one really knew, and Cal didn't seem interested in clarifying. What the townspeople did know was that he took his tea exactly the same way every morning, sat at the same table by the window, and his 2 dogs, Murphy, a calm, golden-eyed retriever, and Diesel, a tall black and tan Doberman, never left his side. They were more than pets. They were family. Murphy had the kind of presence that made children feel safe and grown men feel oddly ashamed for raising their voice around him. Diesel was alert, disciplined, protective, the kind of dog that watched, memorized, and waited. He didn't bark. He calculated. Together, they were a quiet trio in a quiet town. And then came the thunder. It wasn't real thunder, of course. It was the sound of motorcycles, 6 of them, growling down the highway and into town like a storm front of leather and chrome. People looked up from their newspapers and scrambled to collect their groceries. Parents ushered their kids inside. At the Roost, the waitress's hands trembled as she topped off a regular's coffee. You didn't have to be a genius to tell this gang wasn't the kind that stopped for pie and pleasantries. They parked outside the cafe, engines still hot, taking up too much space and making too much noise. At the center of the group sat their leader, Rex Maddox, barrel-chested, heavily bearded, and wearing a smirk that belonged to someone who'd never heard no in his life. Rex got off his bike and stretched. His leather jacket squeaked as he rolled his shoulders. His gang laughed too loud, too quickly, like hyenas waiting for permission. And then he saw them, Murphy and Diesel, calmly sitting by the cafe entrance, exactly where they always were. "Would you look at that?" Rex said, nudging one of his men. "Fancy little princes, aren't they?" The gang laughed. One of them made a fake barking sound. Another tossed a cigarette toward Murphy's paws. It missed, but Murphy's eyes flicked toward the ember and back again without moving his head. That's when Rex decided to make it interesting. He walked over, real slow, like he owned the sidewalk. People inside the cafe watched from behind glass and blinds. Some wanted to step in, but they knew better. Rex wasn't the kind of trouble you solved with words. Without warning, he raised his boot and kicked Murphy in the ribs. Not hard enough to break anything, but just enough to make the dog yelp and stumble sideways. The world paused. Murphy's eyes went wide with confusion. Diesel rose immediately, posture straight, muscles tight, but held back, waiting for a command that hadn't come. The cafe went dead silent. Someone dropped a glass. A child outside froze mid-lick of his ice cream cone. Rex laughed. "Ah, come on. Just having some fun," he said, turning to his gang. But nobody laughed this time. Not really. One of them muttered, "Maybe not smart, man." The rest stayed quiet, their eyes darting because something was off. It wasn't just the act. It was the silence that followed it. A kind of silence that meant something was coming. Inside the cafe, Cal Rourke didn't flinch. He didn't slam his cup down or leap to his feet. Instead, he set his tea gently back on its saucer with a quiet clink. The owner of the Roost, a kindly man named Bernie, paled as he stepped over. "Cal," he said under his breath, "I think that fella just made a serious mistake." Cal said nothing. He stood up, pushed in his chair, and took a slow breath. He wasn't angry. He was clear. There's a difference. Anger is messy. Clarity is cold, purposeful. As he stepped outside, Diesel moved with him, staying just half a step behind. Murphy limped slightly to join them, but Cal paused to kneel and give him a firm rub behind the ear. A silent exchange passed between them, comfort, protection, resolve. Rex noticed the man walking toward him. He grinned. Well, look who. He didn't finish the sentence, because in that moment something shifted, not in sound, but in air pressure, in instinct. That old, primal feeling that tells you the man approaching isn't here to talk. He's here because a line was crossed. Cal stopped just a few feet from Rex. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a threat. He just looked him in the eye and said, "You kicked my dog." Rex Maddox wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a man who looked like he had more in common with a retired forest ranger than a brawler. Cal Rourke stood before him without raising a fist, without changing the calm tone in his voice. He simply stated the truth. "You kicked my dog." It hung in the air heavier than a threat. There was no anger behind it, just the kind of certainty that made the people watching feel more nervous than if he'd shouted. Rex's grin faltered just a bit, but his ego wouldn't let him back down. "Relax, old man. I barely touched the mutt." Behind him, one of the bikers chuckled nervously, but even that sound didn't last long. The townsfolk weren't laughing either. They were watching closely, and some were even stepping outside. A few crossed their arms, others leaned against door frames, eyes narrowing. This wasn't just a street scuffle. This was something different. Inside the roost, Bernie whispered to a waitress, "Go lock the back door, just in case." Cal didn't reply right away. His eyes, a steely gray, didn't move from Rex's face. Murphy was at his side now, licking his lips nervously, his ribcage still slightly trembling from the kick. Diesel stood perfectly still, watching, waiting. Rex puffed out his chest. "You think this is your town or something? You think just 'cause you sit around with your fancy dogs and drink tea that you're better than us?" Cal finally spoke, quiet as ever. "No," he said, "but I do think there's a difference between being feared and being respected. You chose the wrong one." Rex stepped forward, close now, their boots almost touching. Cal didn't move, didn't blink. "You got something to prove?" Rex growled. "No," Cal said, "but it sounds like you do." That's when it happened. It was subtle, barely more than a shift of weight, but Rex moved first. He shoved Cal hard with both hands, expecting him to stumble. Cal didn't. Instead, in one fluid motion, he stepped to the side, caught Rex's arm, and redirected the force. Rex stumbled forward, nearly falling over his own boots. The gang tensed. Diesel gave a low, controlled growl. People watching flinched. Cal raised a hand, not to strike, but as a warning. "You don't want this," he said to Rex. "Not today." Rex spun around, red-faced and humiliated. "You son of a—" He lunged. It was messy, wild, fueled by pride, not purpose. Cal stepped aside again, almost casually, and this time hooked Rex's leg with his own. The biker fell hard, onto the pavement shoulder first, his sunglasses skidding away. The air left his lungs in a grunt. It wasn't a fight. It was a demonstration. The kind that reminded people of how dangerous calm people can be. The crowd murmured. A man by the barber shop whistled softly. A woman put her hand over her mouth and whispered, "My God!" Rex's gang didn't move. Not one of them, because they knew deep down they couldn't win this one. Not like this. Rex groaned and pushed himself up on one elbow. Cal stepped forward, not to attack, but to end it. "I'm not going to hit you," he said, voice steady, "because that's not what this is about. You humiliated yourself the moment you thought hurting a dog would make you look strong." Rex looked up at him, dazed, angry, confused. "Don't mistake cruelty for courage," Cal said. "It's not the same." Rex's jaw twitched, but he didn't rise. Behind him, one of the gang members muttered, "Let's just go, man." Cal looked at the group. None of them met his gaze. And then, from behind, A small voice broke the silence. A boy, maybe 7 years old, stood next to his mother, staring at Murphy. "Is the dog okay?" Cal turned, his whole expression softening in an instant. He crouched beside Murphy and ran his hand gently along the retriever's side. "He's okay," he said, "just shaken up." The boy nodded solemnly, then looked at Rex, who was still on the ground, his pride more bruised than his body. "Why'd he kick him?" the boy asked. No one answered, because no one had a good reason. Rex stood slowly, brushing dust off his jeans. His voice was lower now, the edge gone. "You don't know me," he said, trying to recover some control. "You don't know what I've been through." Cal nodded once, not dismissively, but with something closer to understanding than most expected. "You're right, I don't. But pain isn't an excuse. It's a burden. You carry it, or it carries you." Rex said nothing. He just stood there, breathing hard, heart pounding. His gang stayed frozen, not out of fear but out of clarity. Cal looked at them, then back at Rex. "You can leave now, or you can stay and make it worse." That was the only choice. The gang mounted up. No words, no roars of rebellion, just the sound of defeat in the way they moved. Rex hesitated, glancing at Cal one last time, as if trying to decide whether to spit or say something brave. But he did neither. He climbed onto his bike, and with a few coughs of the engine, they were gone. Silence returned to Dry Creek. Cal turned back toward the café. The crowd parted gently, respectfully. Bernie opened the door without a word. Murphy and Diesel walked beside him, as calm as ever. As Cal stepped inside, someone whispered, "What kind of man does that?" Someone else answered, "The right kind." The sun had shifted by the time the town began to breathe again. Dust still hung in the air where the motorcycles had vanished, and the silence they left behind felt oddly sacred. Inside the roost, the café resumed a quiet hum. Dishes clinked, coffee brewed, and conversation returned, but now with a softer tone, like the town had collectively remembered that dignity didn't need to be loud to be heard. Cal sat back down at his usual table. He hadn't touched his tea since standing up. It had gone cold, but he didn't mind. Murphy lay at his feet, his breathing steady now, head resting gently on Cal's boot. Diesel, ever vigilant, sat nearby, eyes still flicking toward the windows now and then, just in case. Bernie walked over with a fresh cup, setting it down without asking. No words were exchanged. They weren't needed. A few minutes later, a teenager approached, maybe 16, awkward but earnest. He wore a mechanic's uniform with the name, Kyle, stitched onto the chest. "Hey, sir," he asked, shifting his weight. "I saw what you did out there." Cal looked up and waited. Cal continued nervously. "My dad, he used to hit our dog. Said it was to teach him manners, but really, it was just control, you know? I always thought real men did that kind of thing. Like it meant you were strong." Cal didn't interrupt. "But seeing you," Kyle's voice cracked slightly, "you didn't yell. You didn't hit him back harder. You just handled it. And now I think maybe I had the wrong idea." For the first time that day, Cal smiled. Not wide, not for show, just a quiet curve of understanding. "You didn't have the wrong idea," he said. "You just hadn't seen the right one yet." Kyle nodded slowly, then backed away, cheeks red, but eyes bright. That boy would carry the moment with him. Maybe not fully understand it yet, but he would someday. That was enough. Later, after the lunch rush died down, Bernie brought Cal a slice of pie, apple, with cinnamon and a little too much sugar. "No charge," the old man said. "Consider it civic gratitude." Cal raised an eyebrow. "I didn't do it for pie." Bernie chuckled. "I know. That's why it's good." They stood in silence for a moment, looking out the cafe window at the spot where Rex had fallen. Bernie cleared his throat. "You ever think about telling folks where you came from? What you've seen?" Cal didn't answer immediately. He reached down, scratched behind Murphy's ears, then looked up. "I used to think I had to tell people everything just to be understood," he said. Now I think maybe we say more with how we live. Bernie nodded, but there was still curiosity in his eyes. I heard things. That you used to be special ops. Maybe even CIA. That true? Cal's eyes darkened. Not in fear or shame, but in memory. I was a lot of things, he said quietly. Some I'm proud of. Some I'd trade away in a heartbeat. Bernie didn't press. He knew the difference between a man who wouldn't talk and a man who shouldn't. But those dogs, Cal added, gesturing gently toward Murphy and Diesel. They're the best part of my past. Trained in K-9 rescue. Murphy used to sniff out earthquake survivors. Diesel did security runs in war zones. They saved people. Did things I never could. Bernie leaned back, arms folded. Well, they're lucky to have you now. Cal looked down at Murphy's side, where a faint bruise was forming. I'm the lucky one, he said. That evening, as golden light bathed the town in warmth, Cal took the dogs for a walk. No destination, just movement, just breathing. A few townsfolk nodded respectfully as he passed. No longer just the quiet guy with the dogs. Now he was something else. Something more. Not a hero, not a legend. Just a man who reminded them what the world could still look like when it was decent. They stopped near the town square, by the oak tree. A young mother and her daughter were sitting on a bench. The little girl's eyes lit up when she saw Murphy, and Cal gave her a nod. He's gentle, he said. The girl toddled over carefully and pet Murphy with both hands, giggling when the retriever licked her fingers. Does he bite? She asked. No, Cal said. Only loves. The mother smiled. As they walked on, Diesel stayed close, scanning the horizon like a soldier who'd seen too much to ever fully relax. Cal reached down and gave him a firm pat between the shoulders. It's over, he said. For now. But he knew the truth. Peace didn't last forever. Not in the world. Not in a man. Not in a town like this where the wind could change at any time. Still, that didn't mean you had to wait for trouble. It just meant you had to be ready, and know who you were when it came. That night, the town exhaled. Porch lights flickered on across Dry Creek. Moths buzzed lazily around street lamps, and a hush settled in like an old friend. The kind of silence that only exists in small towns where people sleep with their windows cracked open and their doors not quite locked. For most, it was just another evening. But for Cal Rourke, it was something else. A stillness he hadn't felt in years. He sat on the front steps of the small cabin he rented on the edge of town, one hand resting on Murphy's warm back, the other holding a mug of something strong and simple. Diesel lay a few feet away, ears perked toward the woods, not because of threat, just habit. Diesel never stopped listening. There was no TV inside, no radio, just the occasional whisper of wind through pine and the hum of crickets harmonizing with nightfall. Cal didn't need entertainment. He'd seen too much to crave distraction. What he valued now was quiet that wasn't empty, quiet filled with meaning. He glanced down at Murphy, who had fallen asleep with a soft, trusting breath. A scar across the retriever's side caught the moonlight, faint now but still there, the memory of a collapsed building in Turkey, a child trapped for 3 days. Murphy had found her, clawed through stone with bleeding paws until she was safe. That was the thing about scars. They didn't always mean pain. Sometimes they meant survival, just like the ones Cal carried. The next morning he woke before dawn. Old habits die hard. He fed the dogs, strapped on his boots, and took them out before most of the town had stirred. As he passed the general store, he saw Ruth, a widowed retiree who ran the cash register like it was her life's mission. Unlocking the front door, she gave him a curious look, then waved him over. I left something for you behind the counter, she said as he approached. A thank you, from, well, just about everyone. Cal stepped inside, where a brown paper bag sat with his name scrawled in permanent marker. Inside, a tin of Earl Grey tea, a pack of handmade dog treats, and a worn leather keychain with the Dry Creek emblem carved into it. Ruth smiled. Some folks still believe a man's word is his bond, she said. You gave yours without even saying it.
Cal nuda.
I didn't do it for thanks. I know, she said. That's what makes it matter. Word had spread fast. It always did in Dry Creek. By noon, people he barely knew were stopping him on the street. Not with questions, not to gawk, but just to shake his hand. A few offered him beer, one offered a job fixing fence posts. Another slipped a note into his coat pocket that simply read, "Thanks for reminding us." He didn't want the attention, but he understood what it meant. It wasn't about the fight. It wasn't about who fell and who stood tall. It was about what you defended when it counted. And in that moment, Cal hadn't just defended a dog. He defended the idea that small towns still had rules that weren't written down but mattered more than laws. Respect.
Honor.
Restraint. Belonging. That evening, he sat again at his usual table at the Roost. The waitress, Emily, a college dropout who'd come home to help her sick mom, smiled as she set down his tea. "I don't know how you did it," she said softly, "but I think you scared them off for good." "I didn't scare them," Cal replied. "I showed them a mirror. They didn't like what they saw." Emily paused, thinking, "You always talk like that?" Cal smirked. "Only when I have to." She lingered a second longer than usual before returning to the counter. Across the room, a few high school kids sat whispering. Cal caught one of them stealing glances at Diesel. Another pointed discreetly toward Cal's boots. He could hear bits of their conversation. "That's him. The one who didn't flinch. The one who just moved. He didn't mind. Let them talk." Because in a world where most people chased noise, he'd learned the value of being quiet and unmistakable. Later that night, a small knock came at his cabin door. It was Kyle, the teenage mechanic from the café, with grease still under his nails and worry written all over his face. "Hey," Kyle said, shifting from foot to foot. I was wondering if maybe you could teach me, not how to fight like punches and kicks, just how to carry yourself, like you did." Cal didn't answer immediately. He looked at the boy's posture, the clenched hands, the fear hidden behind the eyes. He'd seen that look before in younger soldiers, in himself. "You think strength is about walking into a room and making people move out of your way," Cal said. "But real strength is about walking into a room and making people feel safe." Cal blinked, unsure how to respond. Cal opened the door wider. "Come back tomorrow," he said. "We'll start with how to breathe." Kyle's shoulders dropped an inch. "Yeah? Really? Really?" As Kyle disappeared into the night, Cal stood for a moment, the air cooling around him. Murphy rested his head on the porch. Diesel stood like a statue, tail still. This wasn't what Cal had planned when he came to Dry Creek. He hadn't come to teach, or lead, or fight. He came because he was tired of noise, tired of memory. He came for peace. And yet, somehow, by simply living on his own terms, he had given the town something they didn't know they were missing. Not a savior, a reminder, a man who wasn't afraid of silence, a man who didn't need to prove anything, a man who, when the wind changed, didn't bow to it, but stood still and let it pass. The days that followed were quiet, almost suspiciously so. The sun rose and set over Dry Creek without incident. The usual rhythms returned. The clatter of silverware at the Roost, Ruth sweeping her porch in perfect circles, the postman whistling off-key as he delivered letters that were more ritual than necessity. But beneath the town's restored calm, there was something else. Tension. The kind of hush that feels less like peace and more like the space between the first lightning strike and the thunder that follows. Cal felt it, though no one said anything. It was in the way Diesel's ears twitched at distant sounds that never used to bother him. In the way Murphy lingered closer than usual. In the subtle shift of air pressure when something or someone disturbs the pattern. Cal didn't sleep as deeply those nights. He didn't load his weapon or install cameras. That wasn't his style. But he made small changes. Boots by the door instead of in the closet, porch light left on longer than necessary, a single wooden bat leaning against the cabin wall. Not because he expected a fight, but because he knew what pride and shame could drive a man to do. He'd seen it too many times before. On the third night after the confrontation, Cal took the dogs for a walk along the edge of the pine woods. The stars were just beginning to appear when he spotted headlights far off the highway, slow, deliberate. Too deliberate. Not local. He paused. Murphy stopped beside him. Diesel, silent as ever, stepped forward. Cal crouched next to Murphy and whispered a word only the dogs knew. Something from their training days, simple and coded. Murphy lay down quietly. Diesel moved a few yards ahead and sat, watching the approaching lights with military stillness. The vehicle didn't enter town. It sat at a distance, watching. And then, without warning, the lights snapped off. Cal exhaled through his nose. Whoever it was, they weren't lost. They were deciding. The next morning, Cal went into town as usual. Nothing seemed out of place. The same barbershop conversation about whose son was dating whose niece. The same impatient tapping of the town banker waiting for his to-go coffee. But when Cal walked into the roost, Bernie met his eyes with something close to a warning. "They were here," Bernie said, voice low. "Who?" "Rex's gang. 2 of them. Not him, though. Sat outside. Didn't order anything. Just looked around."
Cal nodded slowly.
"They say anything?"
"No."
"But they left a note." Bernie handed over a napkin. On it, scrawled in angry, uneven pen, "You humiliated him. That don't sit right." Cal folded the napkin, slid it into his pocket. He didn't react outwardly, but inside, a muscle behind his jaw flexed, just once. Murphy lay quietly under the table. Diesel remained at the doorway, facing out, as if he already knew someone was watching. Later that day, Kyle returned for his second lesson. They worked on balance, breathing, the mechanics of presence, how to walk into a room without needing to dominate it, but still command attention. At the end of the session, Kyle asked, "What happens if they come back?" Cal looked him square in the eyes. "They will," he said. "The question is how we meet them when they do." Cal swallowed. "Are you ready?" "I'm not the one who needs to be." That night, Cal sat on his porch again. Murphy curled up near his boots, Diesel standing sentinel. The moon was brighter than usual, almost arrogant in how much it revealed. He stared into the trees. Rex wasn't done. Cal knew it the moment he'd watched the man climb back on his bike. There's a kind of silence a bruised ego makes. Not loud, not immediate, but it circles back, slower, meaner. You can forgive a man's mistake. But most men can't forgive being shown what they really are. Especially not in front of people. Especially not in front of followers who expected a king and got a clown. Somewhere in the trees, a twig snapped. Not wildlife. Footsteps. Cal stood slowly, motioning with his hand. Murphy remained where he was. Diesel disappeared into the dark, swift and without a sound. Seconds passed. Then Diesel reappeared beside him, calm. No bark. No threat detected. But Cal knew better than to feel safe just because tonight was quiet. There's a kind of man who retreats to rethink, to reload. Rex Maddox was exactly that kind. And Cal understood what was coming. Not because he wanted a fight, but because some men only understand peace when they've tasted consequence twice. The morning air was unusually dry, the kind that pulled at your skin and whispered of something coming. The townsfolk of Dry Creek didn't talk about it directly, but they felt it, in the way conversations were shorter, in the glances passed at storefront windows, in how no one let their kids out of sight for too long. Even the roost wasn't its usual self. Bernie served his coffee a little quicker. The regulars sat closer to the door than they normally would. Emily avoided eye contact with the window. Everyone was waiting for something to happen. And by late afternoon, it did. It started the same way it had days earlier, with the low, metallic growl of engines. This time there were only 4. But that made it worse. Quieter. More focused. The way wolves hunt after the pack has failed once. They pulled into town like they'd never left. Except now there was no laughter. No revving for show. Just an uncomfortable efficiency. Like men carrying out a job rather than seeking chaos. Rex Maddox rode in at the center again. But the smirk was gone. His face was harder now, thinner, darker. Less bravado, more calculation. His beard had been trimmed, his jacket buttoned tight. The bruises from last time had faded from his skin, but not from his ego. They parked outside the roost once more. Not a word was spoken as they dismounted. Inside, Cal stood slowly from his usual seat. He didn't rush. He finished his sip of tea, set the cup down with care, and nodded once toward Bernie. "You should close up," Cal said. Bernie gave a grave nod. "Be careful." Outside, Murphy and Diesel were already on alert. Murphy sat, steady as a stone. Diesel stood in the center of the porch, tail still, his body like a coiled spring. Rex stepped forward alone. The rest of his gang stayed back, arms crossed, eyes scanning the crowd that had begun to gather again. But this time was different. No curiosity, no fear, just readiness. The people of Dry Creek weren't just watching anymore. They were witnessing. Cal stepped down from the porch. He didn't say anything at first. Neither did Rex. The silence between them was thick. Not like before, not electric. This time it was heavier, almost sad. Two men who understood what was about to happen, and how little either of them actually wanted it. Finally, Cal spoke. "You had your chance to walk away." Rex took a breath, slow and sharp. "Yeah. Well, turns out I don't sleep well after being made a fool." "You weren't made a fool," Cal said. "You just had to see yourself clearly. That's different." Rex's eyes darkened. "You act like you're better than everyone else, like you've got it all figured out. Truth is, you're just another ghost hiding behind a couple of dogs and a quiet stare." Cal didn't flinch. He simply nodded, slow, deliberate. "You're right," he said. "I am a ghost in a way. I've done things I regret, seen things I wish I could forget. But I've learned to live with those things, not hide behind them." Rex took a step forward. "You think these people actually care about you? They'll turn on you the second it stops being convenient." Cal's gaze didn't shift. "I don't need them to care," he said. "But I won't let someone like you teach them to be afraid again." Another step from Rex. "And what if I say I'm not here to talk anymore?" Cal breathed in deeply. "Then we're done talking." The first punch came from Rex. Fast, sharper than last time, fueled by anger held on a low boil for too long. But Cal saw it coming. He stepped aside, grabbed Rex's wrist mid-swing, and twisted just enough to throw him off balance. Rex stumbled but stayed up. This time he didn't taunt. He came again. A flurry of strikes, fast and practiced. Cal blocked, redirected, stepped in, one clean elbow to the ribs, not enough to break, but enough to take breath. Rex coughed, stumbled back. From behind him, one of the bikers took a step forward. Diesel growled, a sound deep and primal. Cal didn't look, but his voice cut the air like a blade. "This is between him and me." The biker stopped, and for a brief second something shifted. The people of Dry Creek took a collective step closer. They weren't there to fight. They were there to stand behind the man who had stood for them. Rex charged again, this time aiming low, grabbing at Cal's waist, trying to take him down by force. Cal went with the momentum, used it, twisted, flipping Rex over his shoulder with a move learned not in a gym, but in years of training and real-world necessity. Rex hit the dirt hard, coughed, then rolled onto his back. This time, Cal didn't approach. He stood over him, breathing steady, hands loose by his sides. "You can keep doing this," he said. "But every time you do, it's not me you're losing to. It's the part of you that still thinks fear is the only kind of power." Rex sat up slowly, blood on his lip, breathing ragged. "You don't know what I've been through." "I don't need to," Cal replied. "I know what you do with it." Silence again. Then Rex did something no one expected. He dropped his fists, sat back on the dirt, and stared at the ground. Not broken, but maybe finally exhausted. From the fight, from the fear, from chasing something that never delivered what it promised. Cal didn't speak again. He simply turned, walked back toward the porch and said only, "Let it end here." And for once, Rex said nothing. Spring came early to Dry Creek that year. The winter frost melted sooner than usual, and the oak tree at the center of town sprouted its first green buds like a promise that things could grow again, even in places that had long stood still. Life had returned to its rhythms. But something deeper had settled into the cracks of the town's sidewalks, into the chipped paint of storefronts and the hush before dawn. A kind of reverence. Not for one man, but for what he'd reminded them. The world wasn't short on loudness, but it had a shortage of clarity, of men who chose stillness over spectacle, restraint over dominance. And though no one put up a plaque or held a ceremony, Cal Rourke had changed Dry Creek. One quiet day at a time. It was a warm Saturday morning when Cal walked with Murphy and Diesel to the edge of town, where the hills rolled out into soft, golden earth. Kyle walked beside him, hands in his pockets, a small notebook sticking out of the back of his jeans. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. "I've been thinking," Kyle finally said, eyes on the horizon, "about leaving someday, going to school, maybe something with wildlife, dogs, training. But I don't know if that means I'm leaving something behind." Cal slowed his steps, then stopped and looked out toward the hills. "Leaving," he said, "isn't the same as forgetting. You take the right things with you." Kyle nodded, then glanced at Murphy. "Think he'd train a new guy?"
Cal smiled finally.
"Murphy's picky, but he knows a good heart when he sees one." They stood there for a while, watching a hawk circle overhead. Just a boy on the edge of manhood, and a man on the far edge of war and wandering, connected not by blood, but by something even quieter, trust. A few days later, a man from out of town stopped in for gas. He asked Bernie at the counter, "Where can I find the guy who shut down that biker gang?" Bernie didn't flinch, just rang up the total and handed over the receipt. "There's no guy like that here," he said. "But there's a man who walks his dogs every morning, and you're welcome to say hello to him, like everyone else." The man left, and Bernie smiled to himself. Because legends don't live in towns like Dry Creek. But character? That's different. Character lingers. One morning, Cal left early with Murphy and Diesel, heading into the forest trails just beyond the ridge. The air was sharp, but clean. Birds stirred. Pine needles crunched beneath his boots. Hours passed. He returned near sunset. Only Murphy and Diesel knew what he'd gone to do, or what had been on his mind. But from that day forward, Cal began to speak a little more. Not much, but enough to teach Kyle how to listen. Enough to answer when Emily asked about fear and forgiveness. Enough to laugh once with Ruth over a story about a dog who stole a Thanksgiving turkey whole. On the first day of summer, the town held a small festival. Nothing big. A few booths. Some music. Lemonade and laughter and sunlight on shoulders. Cal stood by a tree, watching it all from a distance. Murphy lay under the shade. Diesel sat beside a stroller, letting a baby tug gently at his ear without a flinch. Kyle walked by with a girl from school, waving.
Cal nudda.
He didn't need a seat at the center. He didn't need to be thanked. The proof was all around him. The peace was holding. The fear was gone. And the quiet had stayed. That night, just as the last of the string lights dimmed and the town turned in, Cal sat once more on his porch. The sky was endless and soft. Murphy's breath was slow, steady. Diesel leaned against his leg. Cal looked out at the road. There would be other storms, other towns, other men with too much pride and too little direction. But not tonight. Tonight there was only this, and that was enough. Epilogue. Years later, long after Cal had gone, no one quite knew where, the people of Dry Creek still told the story. Not with exaggeration or bluster, just truth. A man came to town. He said little. He walked with his dogs. And when trouble came, he didn't strike first. He stood still. And because of that, the town remembered what real strength looked like. It wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel. It didn't come in swinging. It arrived gently, stood tall, and left quietly, like wind through the trees.